Welcome back to Python Filing Part 2, Processing Complex Text Files. So to recap what we did last lesson, we looked at reading and writing two text files. We looked at reading an entire text file using the .read method. We also looked at reading one line at a time from a text file using the .readline method. And then we dealt with more complex files, i.e. multiple lines in a text file by using the for loop and attaching the contents to a list. And then we also looked at writing a list to a text file. So if we take the players.txt file for the last two programs, we'll notice that each person's name is stored on each line. However, this is a little bit limited because if you want to store separate items of data associated with each person's name, then using this method we can't do it unless we create, say, another file. So one way of doing this is using what we call a CSV file, which CSV standing for Common Separated Values. This is the idea that we can store multiple values on a single line of text and separating those values using a comma. So if I take the scores.txt file, for example, which stores the name John and their score, which is 32, and separate the two values using a comma. Again, we have the carriage return at the end of the first line, which tells us to go to the next line, and we store the next person's name with an associated score. And again, this is separated using the comma. And this we can carry on for the rest of the file. Now, the beauty of this is we can not only just store one value, so say John has multiple scores in a game, we can store each one separately, separating them using a comma, and this can go on indefinitely until it hits the carriage return and goes to the next line. How do we process a CSV file in Python? Well, if we take the program that we had earlier and we have player score, which we define as an empty list, and then we open the file scores.txt. And then, as per normal, we do a for loop which goes through each line of the text file, and each line we append to the players list, stripping out the carriage return at the end. So if we were to print the players list, we'd have the following. Now you'll notice this isn't really processed as CSV file, because if we take the first item or element in the list, you'll see that John, 32 hasn't been separated. It is still in the first element of a list. So how do we do this? Processing the comma. So we're going to take the program we had before and make slight alterations to lines 4 and 5. So we take line 4, we create a label called data, we read the line and we strip out the carriage return, and we add this special command called .split, which will take the string, and where it finds the comma, it will remove that item and put it into a list. So if we look at the scores.txt file, what this will mean, it will take the first line, i.e. John, 32, split it into a separate list, so John and 32 are now two separate items in the list, and in the next line of code, line 5, we will then append that list to the player's scores list, as you can see here. Again, we repeat the loop, so we take the next line, #30, use the .split command to split the two items where the comma is found into a separate list, with #30 as a list, and then we append that list to the player's scores list. And then we do that for the remainder of the lines in the text file. So now we have a different kind of list. We have a list with sub-elements in it, or sub-lists, as you can see here. So John and 32, Asher and 30, Sally and 30, or Brenda and 24 are now sub-lists within a player's scores list. So using this list with sublist, I'm going to show you a sample program that's going to prompt the user for a name and then return that name's scores. So if we look at this program, line 10 simply takes a name as an input for the user. In this case, I'm going to put in Asher. We then create a loop in line 11, which is going to go through each sub list within the player scores list and return it to the label player. In this case, the first element is John 32, so we go on to line 12 that says look at the first element of that sub list, which in this case is John. And then we compare John with the name that we've entered. It's not Asher, so we go back through the loop. We take the next element in the list, the sub list, and then we compare the first element of the sub list, in this case Asher, with the name that we've entered. They are the same, so we go to the line 13, which will print all the scores for Asher, i.e. from element 1 onwards. Now, of course, this program will continue to loop even though we have found the name, and we could improve the program by adding a while loop so that when it finds the name, it finishes. Also, we could have different ways of extracting the CSV file into either one list or sublist within sublist within sublists, or we might even convert it into dictionaries so that you just search up the name you're looking for and it will find it straight away. The point is, with a CSV file you can do that kind of processing, and that's the great thing about them. So finally, writing to a CSV file. So here we have a program, slightly more complicated than before because we are writing the file as opposed to reading it. We have a list at the top, and then we're creating a loop within a loop to deal with the commas and so forth. So if we take the players' scores, we set up the list as per normal, and then we go to the second line, which creates the file, scores2.txt, and notice the W for the right. Then we create a loop which is going to go for each line within the text file for the number of sub elements in the list, and we take the first element or sub list from the list. Now notice that this list has multiple values of integer as opposed to string, which we have to deal with later. So John has multiple values as opposed to the rest that only have single values. So we have to create a loop that deals with the different lists lengths. So to deal with this, we create a sub loop at line 4, which will go to the line -1. So it's going to go through for the entire sub list until except the last one, and it's going to allocate it to element, and then we write element to the screen. Notice that we use the string function to convert the integer into a string. If it's a string already, doesn't matter, it will convert it to a string because we can only write strings to text file. And then at the end of each one we add a comma. Now notice that this will only do all the way up to the last character. It won't include the last character, hence the -1. The reason for this, because on the last character we need to take the last character, we take the length, which is the length of the sub list, -1, because the index starts from 0, and then we add the carriage return, because the last character, rather than having a comma, has to have a carriage return. So in this case 10, rather than having comma, will have carriage return. And then this will continue for the remaining sublists within the list and write it to the file accordingly. And then finally we will close the file with file.close. So I haven't strictly been honest here, because a CSV file would normally contain headers, i.e. name and score, the column headings, and then contain the data that you would want under each column. And now the reason I didn't use that earlier was because I wanted multiple scores for different people, in which case I'd have to create multiple columns. So also we can have the CSV import shown here, and with the CSV import you can then simplify your code by simply specifying the delimiter, the thing that separates the columns, in this case the comma, and then we can simply loop through the row, the list, without having to do any further processing. And in this particular example, we look at the first line, which will tell us what the column headings are, i.e. line 0, and then following that, the following lines would be the data that you want to extract, in this case column 0 and column 1. And then we'd simply increment the line as we go through each row in the CSV file. Again, you could use this method, there's nothing wrong with this method, but I just wanted to show you alternatives of processing a text file. So to summarise what we have learned in this lesson, so we learned what a CSV file is and the nature of a CSV file. We also looked at how to process files in terms of looping through and detecting where there's a comma in the field. They also looked at saving a CSV file and how we go through line by line and making sure we include the comma to separate the data fields. And then we also looked at the more simplified method of using the CSV Python library import to process CSV files. Thank you for watching, and I hope you subscribe to this channel, Compshaw, so that you can see wonderful videos like this in the future. Thank you.